Beaverhead County, Montana Territory. October 1878. The first snow had already dusted the peaks when Lars Eriksson began hauling limestone from the creek bed. His neighbors watched from their cabin doors, shaking their heads. The Norwegian immigrant was building something they'd never seen before, a second wall of stone standing 3 feet from his log cabin, running the entire perimeter. 22 feet of gap, filled with nothing but air. Waste of a good winter, muttered Samuel Carter, leaning against his axe. Man's losing his mind before the cold even hits. But Lars kept stacking. Methodically. Precisely. The way his grandfather had taught him in the Valdres valleys, where winter meant survival depended on understanding something American builders had forgotten or never knew. What did this Norwegian stonemason grasp about thermal physics that experienced frontiersmen dismissed as madness? The answer would reveal itself when January's brutal cold separated the living from the frozen. Before we go further, if you want to discover how ancient building techniques outperformed modern methods, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and I promise you'll learn a frontier survival principle that could save your life in a grid-down scenario. Let's dive in. Lars Eriksson arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1877. His stonemason's tools wrapped in oiled canvas, his head full of Norwegian building wisdom that stretched back for centuries. By autumn 1878, he'd built himself a solid spruce log cabin, 16 by 20 feet, chinked with clay and moss, a respectable structure by any frontier standard. Then he started the project that made his neighbors question his sanity. Every morning for 6 weeks, Lars hauled stones. Not for a hearth, not for a foundation. He was building a secondary wall that stood exactly 36 inches from his cabin's exterior logs. The stones varied. Limestone from the creek, sandstone from the ridge, river granite for the base. Each piece selected for specific thermal properties he never bothered explaining to the men who watched him work. Eriksson's building a fence around his house, Bradley Thompson announced to the Trading Post, his tone mixing amusement with genuine concern. A stone fence, 3 feet out from the walls, like he's trying to keep his cabin from escaping. The laughter rippled through the small gathering of settlers. But veteran builder James McCarthy didn't laugh. He studied Lars's work with narrowed eyes, then declared his professional judgment. Waste of labor and material. That gap's going to create a wind tunnel that'll freeze him faster than an open door. Mark my words, he'll be tearing it down come February, begging for proper insulation techniques. Lars heard the criticism. He'd heard it before, in different languages, in different valleys. Old world methods always look foolish to new world confidence. He just kept stacking stones, creating a double wall structure that enclosed his cabin in a thermal envelope none of them recognized. The cavity between cabin and stone wall measured precisely 36 inches, wide enough for air circulation, narrow enough to prevent convective heat loss, exactly the dimension his grandfather had taught him for the Valdres mountain climate. By late November, the structure stood complete. 4 walls of stacked stone, each rising 7 feet high, creating a protected courtyard around his cabin. The stones weren't mortared solid. Lars had left strategic gaps, spaces that would allow moisture to escape while trapping warmer air close to the cabin logs. To his neighbors, it looked like sloppy masonry. To Lars, it was calculated engineering refined over generations of Norwegian winters where mistakes meant death. He'll learn, McCarthy told anyone who'd listen. Cold's the best teacher a fool can have. What Lars Eriksson understood, and what his critics dismissed, was thermal mass principle that had kept Scandinavian families alive through Arctic winters for centuries. The stone walls weren't decoration. They were a heat battery designed to absorb, store, and radiate warmth long after the fire burned low. The physics were elegant in their simplicity. During the day, when Lars burned wood in his firebox, the heat didn't just warm the cabin's interior. It radiated outward through the log walls. In a standard cabin, that heat escaped directly into the frigid air, lost forever. But Lars's stone barrier stood waiting, 36 inches away, its 4,200 pounds of limestone and sandstone absorbing every BTU that would otherwise vanish into the Montana wind. The stone's thermal capacity exceeded wood by a factor of 3, while his neighbor's log walls released their meager heat within 2 hours of the fire dying. Lars's stone walls held warmth for 14 to 16 hours, radiating it back toward the cabin throughout the night. The 36-inch air gap functioned as an insulation buffer, wide enough to prevent direct conduction losses, yet narrow enough that the radiant heat from the stones couldn't dissipate before reaching the cabin walls. He'd selected his stones deliberately. Limestone for the outer faces, dense, high thermal mass, capable of absorbing and holding heat. Sandstone for interior sections, slightly more porous, releasing stored warmth more gradually. River granite at the base, virtually indestructible, providing structural stability and additional thermal sink. The unmortared gaps weren't construction flaws. They were moisture vents, preventing condensation buildup that would reduce thermal efficiency and rot the cabin logs. "It's Highland foolishness," declared James McCarthy, examining the structure with professional disdain. "That stone's going to draw cold like a lightning rod draws electricity." He surrounded his cabin with a freezer wall. Bradley Thompson agreed. "My grandfather built 30 cabins in Pennsylvania. Never saw anything like this. There's a reason we don't do it, because it doesn't work." Even Lars's few friends expressed concern. "You sure about this, Lars?" asked young Peter Johansson, himself a recent immigrant. "These men have survived Montana winters. Maybe American methods work better here than Norwegian ones." Lars just smiled, checking the stone alignment with his level. "Temperature doesn't care about nationality, Peter. Thermal mass is thermal mass, whether in Valdres or Beaverhead County. Come January, we'll let physics do the talking." What none of them understood was that Lars had built the exact same design in Norway's Valdres region, where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -20 Fahrenheit. His grandfather's cabin, built in 1834 with an identical stone thermal envelope, had sheltered 3 generations through Arctic conditions, using half the firewood of conventional structures. The principle wasn't theory. It was proven engineering, tested by the cruelest examiner, Norwegian winter. But proof required demonstration. And demonstration required the one thing no man could schedule: a truly brutal cold snap that would push every cabin to its thermal limits. Lars didn't have to wait long. January 12, 1879. The barometer had been falling for 2 days, and experienced frontiersmen recognized the signs. This wasn't ordinary cold approaching. This was a killer. The temperature dropped 18 degrees between noon and sunset. By midnight, it had reached -22 Fahrenheit. By 3 in the morning, -34, the coldest night Beaverhead County had recorded in 7 years. The kind of cold that froze spit before it hit the ground, that cracked green timber with sounds like rifle shots, that could kill an unprotected man in under 20 minutes. In Bradley Thompson's cabin, the family huddled near the fireplace, feeding logs every 40 minutes. His wife had hung blankets across the interior walls, creating a smaller insulated space, but still their breath condensed in visible clouds. The children slept in shifts, never more than 6 feet from the flames. He burned through 18 logs between midnight and dawn, nearly twice his normal consumption, and still the temperature inside his cabin hovered around 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls, despite being solid spruce logs 8 inches thick, might as well have been paper against that penetrating cold. James McCarthy fared slightly better. His cabin featured a corner fireplace design he'd brought from Pennsylvania, and he'd banked the fire properly before midnight. But by 4 a.m., he was awake and feeding wood, watching frost patterns creep across his interior walls despite the blazing hearth. His thermometer, he was proud of owning one, registered 39 degrees at the warmest spot in the cabin, 6 feet from the fire. Across the settlement, the story repeated. Families burning through wood supplies at alarming rates. Livestock brought inside for their body heat. Water buckets frozen solid despite being kept indoors. This was survival cold, the kind that reminded settlers why Montana Territory remained underpopulated despite the promise of land grants. At first light, Samuel Carter ventured outside to check his stock. He noticed something odd immediately. Every cabin chimney in sight poured thick smoke, except one. Lars Eriksson's chimney showed only a thin wisp, the signature of a fire barely maintained. "Damn fools frozen solid," Carter muttered, genuinely concerned now. He pulled his scarf tighter and trudged toward Lars's strange, stone-enclosed cabin, preparing to find the Norwegian either dead or hypothermic, a cautionary tale about ignoring American building wisdom. The snow crunched under his boots with that distinctive sound that only happens below -20. He reached the stone wall perimeter and noticed the first oddity. The stones themselves radiated faint warmth. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. He could feel it on his exposed cheeks as he passed through the gap in the wall that served as Lars's entrance. The cabin door stood slightly ajar. Carter pushed it open, ready to call for help. Lars Eriksson sat at his table, in his shirt sleeves, eating breakfast. No coat, no blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The cabin interior felt like a spring morning. "Samuel," Lars greeted him calmly. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Carter stood speechless, cold air from outside mixing with the incomprehensible warmth of the interior. His eyes found the fireplace. Nothing but glowing embers, clearly not fed for hours. Yet the cabin felt warmer than Carter's own home, with a roaring fire consuming log after log. "Ow!" was all Carter could manage. Lars gestured toward the stone walls visible through his small window. "The stones remember yesterday's fire. They're still giving it back." By noon on January 13th, the temperature had climbed to -8 Fahrenheit, still brutal, but no longer lethal. Word had spread fast. Men who'd mocked Lars Eriksson's stone walls now gathered at his cabin, trying to understand what they'd witnessed. James McCarthy brought his thermometer, the same instrument that had registered 39 degrees in his own cabin during the worst of the cold. He insisted on verification. Lars welcomed the inspection. Interior temperature of Lars's cabin at 11 a.m., 6 hours after his last significant fire, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. McCarthy checked the instrument 3 times, certain it was malfunctioning. It wasn't. The stone walls, still radiating stored heat, had kept the interior a full 32 degrees warmer than McCarthy's cabin at the same moment, and Lars had burned less than half the wood. The men walked the perimeter, examining the stone structure with new eyes. Bradley Thompson placed his bare hand against the inner stone surface. Still warm. Not hot enough to burn, but warm enough that he could feel heat radiating toward the cabin logs even now, mid-morning, with the fire reduced to ash. "How much did you burn last night?" McCarthy asked, professional pride wounded, but curiosity overriding ego. Lars consulted his log. He'd been keeping careful records. 4 logs. From 8 p.m. to midnight. Lit burned down to coals after that. For logs, McCarthy had burned 18. Thompson had burned 21. Peter Johansson, whose smaller cabin should have required less fuel, had burned 15 and still woke to frost on his blankets. The mathematics were undeniable. Lars's stone thermal envelope had reduced his fuel consumption by approximately 60%, while maintaining interior temperatures 28 to 32 degrees higher than conventional cabins. More importantly, the heat retention extended through the night. While his neighbors had been forced to wake every 2 hours to feed their fires or risk freezing, Lars had slept soundly, trusting his stone walls to return the heat he'd invested during the evening. "Explain the physics," McCarthy demanded, not hostile now, but genuinely seeking understanding. Lars walked them through the principle he'd tried to articulate back in October, when they'd called him a fool. The stone walls absorbed radiant heat during active burning. Their tremendous mass, over 4,000 pounds, required enormous energy to warm, but once heated, they released that energy slowly, steadily, over 12 to 16 hours. The 36-inch air gap prevented direct heat loss while allowing the stone's radiant warmth to reflect back toward the cabin. Essentially, he created a thermal flywheel, storing excess heat during peak burning and releasing it during the cold hours when most cabins grew dangerously frigid. "It's not new," Lars explained. "My grandfather built this design in 1834. His father learned it from Norwegian builders who'd been refining it since the 1600s. When your winter can kill you, you learn to respect heat storage." Bradley Thompson did the calculations in his head. If this design could reduce wood consumption by 60% over a full Montana winter, say 5 months of serious cold, a family could save somewhere between 40 and 60 cords of wood. That wasn't just convenience. That was the difference between exhausting your timber supply in March and having enough to last until spring. In practical terms, it might be the difference between survival and catastrophe. Why didn't you explain this in October? Peter Johansson asked. Lars shrugged. Would you have believed me? Or would you have needed to feel it yourself? The question hung in the cold air, unanswered, because every man there knew the truth. They wouldn't have believed. American confidence had assumed Norwegian methods were primitive, outdated, inferior. It had taken 34 below zero to teach them that thermal physics didn't care about national pride. If you're learning something that could change how you think about heating and survival, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment below, what's the coldest temperature you've ever endured? Let's keep this knowledge alive. By late February 1879, Bradley Thompson was hauling limestone. Not for commentary, not for skepticism, for construction. His conversion had been immediate. The morning after the brutal cold snap, he'd approached Lars with an offer. Teach him the technique, and he'd provide the labor to help another settler build the same system. Lars agreed, with one condition. Thompson had to understand the principles, not just copy the design. Thermal mass engineering required thinking, not just stacking stones. They started with Thompson's own cabin. The work was harder than Thompson anticipated. Lars insisted on stone selection based on density and thermal properties, not just availability. He demanded precise spacing for the air gap, not 30 inches, not 40 inches, exactly 36 inches, the optimal distance for radiant heat reflection without excessive air circulation. He explained the strategic gaps in the stonework, how moisture management was as critical as heat retention. Build it wrong, Lars warned, and you create a cold sink instead of a thermal battery. The stone must breathe. The air must move slowly, not freely. Every gap matters. Thompson learned. By mid-March, his cabin wore its own stone thermal envelope. The next cold spell, -14 Fahrenheit in late March, a late-season killer, provided immediate validation. Thompson's wood consumption dropped by 58% compared to the previous winter. His children slept warm through the night. His wife cried with relief the first morning she didn't wake to frozen water buckets. James McCarthy held out longer. Professional pride kept him skeptical through February. But when he calculated the potential wood savings, and when he admitted that his own cabin had come dangerously close to dropping below freezing during that January night, he approached Lars in early April. Teach me, was all he said. Lars taught him, not with mockery or vindication, but with patience. McCarthy proved an excellent student, his builder's experience translating quickly once he understood the thermal principles. By October 1879, McCarthy's cabin boasted the third stone thermal envelope in Beaverhead County, and he was already planning modifications. Angled stone faces to capture more southern sun, darker stones on the south wall to absorb more daytime heat. The technique spread like understanding through a community that had learned humility. Peter Johansson built one in May. Samuel Carter started his in June, finishing before the first snow. By December 1879, 11 cabins in the immediate settlement featured stone thermal envelopes. By March 1880, that number had grown to 23 cabins within a 50-mile radius. Each builder added refinements. Some incorporated reflective metal surfaces in the air gap to increase radiant transfer. Others experimented with different stone types, discovering that volcanic rock, abundant in some areas, provided even better thermal storage than limestone. A few settlers created hybrid designs, combining the Norwegian stone envelope with Russian-style masonry stoves, achieving heat retention that extended beyond 24 hours. The economic impact rippled through the community. Families saved an average of 42 cords of wood per winter, representing hundreds of hours of labor not spent felling, hauling, splitting, and stacking. Children suffered fewer cold-related illnesses. Livestock mortality decreased as families could afford to heat small barn sections. The settlement's overall timber consumption dropped by an estimated 38%, reducing pressure on nearby forests and extending the viable timber supply by years. In 1881, a territorial surveyor documenting building methods across Montana specifically noted the Norwegian thermal wall technique employed in Beaverhead County settlements as a significant innovation in frontier construction. His report included detailed measurements, diagrams, and temperature data that Lars had meticulously recorded. By 1883, variations of the design appeared in Wyoming territory, carried by settlers who'd learned the method from Montana neighbors. The technique acquired different names: Norwegian walls, stone heat jackets, thermal fences, but the principle remained Lars Eriksson's grandfather's wisdom, proven against Montana's coldest winter. What had begun as mockery had become standard practice. What they'd called primitive had revealed itself as sophisticated engineering. And the man they'd called a fool had given them a technology that would save lives, resources, and forests for generations. Lars Eriksson never sought vindication. He'd built his stone thermal envelope for survival, not for proof. But on a spring morning in 1884, 5 years after that brutal January night, he stood beside James McCarthy, watching a young homesteader from Illinois break ground for Montana's 47th documented stone wall cabin. "You changed how we build here," McCarthy said, and there was no resentment in his voice anymore. Only respect earned through frozen nights and saved lives. Lars shook his head. "I didn't change anything. I just remembered what my grandfather taught me. The knowledge was always there. You just had to be willing to learn it." That distinction mattered, because what happened in Beaverhead County between 1878 and 1884 wasn't the story of one man's innovation. It was the story of a community learning to recognize engineering wisdom they dismissed as primitive ignorance. The territorial records from that period reveal the cost of that initial arrogance. During the winter of 1877 to 1878, before Lars built his stone envelope, Beaverhead County settlements recorded 11 deaths attributed to exposure and insufficient heating. 3 of those were children. Families had burned through their entire winter wood supply by February, forcing desperate choices between freezing and burning furniture, structural timbers, anything combustible. The winter of 1879 to 1880, after stone thermal envelopes had been adopted by 23 families, recorded 0 cold-related deaths in those households. Wood supplies lasted through April. Children slept warm. The difference wasn't marginal. It was the difference between life and death, measured in degrees Fahrenheit and cords of saved firewood. Yet the lesson extended beyond Montana territory. When Lars's technique appeared in the Territorial Surveyor's 1881 report, builders across the frontier faced a choice: acknowledge that primitive Norwegian methods outperformed American confidence, or maintain their assumptions and continue wasting resources and lives. Most chose pride over physics. In Wyoming settlements where the report circulated, only 18% of builders adopted the stone envelope designed despite clear documentation of its effectiveness. In Colorado territory, the number was lower, less than 12%. American exceptionalism, it seemed, was a harder barrier than 34 below zero. But in the settlements where humility overrode ego, the results repeated Lars's success. A cluster of Norwegian and Swedish immigrants in northern Wyoming built 17 stone envelope cabins between 1882 and 1885, creating a microregion with fuel efficiency that astounded visiting surveyors. Their wood consumption averaged 41% lower than comparable settlements just 20 miles away. Their winter mortality rate was effectively 0. The physics didn't care about national pride. Thermal mass storage worked identically whether the builder was Norwegian, American, Swedish, or Chinese. A pound of limestone heated to 150 degrees Fahrenheit stored the same BTUs regardless of who stacked it. The radiant heat laws, discovered by Joseph Fourier in 1822, applied universally, indifferent to the cultural assumptions of frontier builders. What Lars Eriksson had proven What that brutal January night in 1879 had demonstrated beyond argument was that dismissing traditional knowledge as backward often revealed not the ignorance of the tradition, but the arrogance of the dismisser. His grandfather's design wasn't primitive. It was 4 centuries of refined engineering, tested against Arctic conditions where failure meant extinction, improved across generations of builders who understood that winter was the ultimate examiner and survival was the only passing grade. Modern building science would eventually rediscover these principles. By the 1970s, thermal mass storage became a recognized component of passive solar design. Contemporary sustainable architecture now incorporates the exact concepts Lars's grandfather had mastered in 1834: strategic thermal mass placement, radiant heat capture, calculated air gaps for insulation without conduction loss. We gave it new names, wrapped it in technical language, published research papers proving what Norwegian builders had known for centuries. But the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. Heat storage matters more than heat generation. A cabin that retains 70% of its warmth overnight outperforms a cabin that generates intense heat but loses it immediately. Efficiency trumps power. Storage beats production. These weren't new insights in 1879. They were ancient wisdom that American builders had to learn through suffering before they'd accept it from a Norwegian immigrant's hands. Lars Ericsson died in 1903 at 71 years old, in the same cabin he'd built in 1877. The stone walls still stood, still functioned, still radiated stored heat through Montana winters that killed less prepared neighbors. His children inherited not just a structure, but a principle. Question assumptions, respect knowledge regardless of its origin, and trust physics over pride. The stones themselves outlasted the man. Territorial record from 1924 note that several stone-enclosed cabins of Norwegian design remain occupied and functional in Beaverhead County, some exceeding 40 years of continuous use with minimal maintenance. Lars's original structure stood until 1931, when his grandson finally replaced it. Not because the thermal envelope failed, but because the interior cabin logs, after 54 Montana winters, had finally succumbed to age. By then, the technique had spread across 3 territories and 2 states. Estimated total: over 300 stone thermal envelope structures, saving an aggregate of approximately 12,000 cords of wood annually, preventing uncounted deaths, proving that the knowledge settlers had mocked in 1878 was engineering they should have celebrated. The question Lars had answered, what did this Norwegian understand that American builders missed, had a simple response. He understood that wisdom doesn't belong to nations or eras. It belongs to anyone humble enough to learn it, test it, and pass it forward. If this story taught you something about respecting traditional knowledge and thinking beyond modern assumptions, do 3 things. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss these frontier survival principles. And comment below, what traditional technique do you think modern society has foolishly abandoned? Let's learn from the past to survive the future. The stones around Lars Ericsson's cabin kept him 32 degrees warmer because 4 centuries of Norwegian winters had taught his ancestors what Montana builders had to learn through frost and failure. That mockery is easy, but understanding requires humility, and survival demands respect for knowledge tested by the cruelest teacher of all, winter that kills the arrogant and spares the wise.